a while. Around here, that includes things like sea level rise. We are, of course, one of the hardest hit areas along the East Coast because our land is both sinking as well as sea levels rising. You can't go a day, I don't think, without seeing those effects or certainly hearing something about them. There are also, of course, changes in temperature. Global temperatures around the world are going up. It seems like every year I hear on the news, we've hit the record again of the hottest year ever. And of course, changes in precipitation, and not all of these changes in precipitation have necessarily been in terms of more precipitation. So as this map shows, the Midwest is getting a lot more. Some other areas are getting a lot less. And of course, we've all heard of, drought situation in California and the Southwest for a long time that has been only recently alleviated with annual changes in precipitation, very recent changes in precipitation. These changes, as well as others, of course, have led to changes in Earth's ecosystems. With regard to organismal systems, loss of biodiversity has been something that we have documented as well as kind of predicted ongoing losses for the future. For example, 29% fewer wild birds documented since 1970, 20% lower abundance of native species of plants since 1900. Kind of predictions for the future are, of course, that more than 1 million species are threatened with extinction around the world. And that's a number that gets thrown out there. It's certainly supported by some data, but it's a difficult number to come up with because we can't open up our magic balls and predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. But there is great consensus that living systems on Earth are threatened by climate change, as well as other aspects of our behavior that are reducing their population sizes and reducing interactions that they have with other aspects of those ecosystems. Of course, scientists are very interested in understanding these changes from physical as well as natural perspectives. With regard to biologists, I would say these 4 things that I have outlined on this slide really point to the big things that we're interested in studying in terms of how climate change is impacting systems. Understanding those impacts to human health and livelihood. Folks who are working on the water or working on the land directly, how are they going to make a living in the future? I personally come from a family that worked on the water, and I have seen, those changes come in terms of kind of ups and downs in the number of crabs and the number of oysters that are available. Understanding how life changes in response to environmental perturbations. We're experiencing change, and change is certainly something that has happened in the history of Earth, and organisms have had to respond to those changes. And we certainly study that largely from the fossil record. But as we live through change, it's very interesting to be able to study it in the here and now and make predictions about the future as well. Of course, we would like to lose no species, I think, except maybe those invasive species or ones that are some of the most horrible to us. Like for me, it's poison ivy. I would have no qualms about getting rid of poison ivy. But in general, I think we're trying to maintain natural systems and the diversity of species that have been on Earth for a long time. And so this information also goes towards protecting individual species as well as ecosystems. And then kind of looking to the future, understanding that that's not going to be possible to conserve all species, and that change is a natural part of Earth's systems. What are future communities and ecosystems going to look like? So sort of, becoming those readers of magic balls and predicting future life forms on Earth, and what species are going to be the winners and what species are going to be the losers. This, of course, takes a lot of data. It's a massive undertaking. And that's because there are a lot of moving parts. So, for example, there are changes going on that are not necessarily the same direction in every part of the country. Here is another temperature map showing you kind of trends, average temperature trends from 1895 to 2016. And while some areas are not increasing in temperature an extreme amount, other areas like the Midwest, upper Midwest, and the Northeast have really hit the gauge in terms of their increases in temperature. This, of course, impacts organisms. So if we think about something like red maple, on the right is shown its geographic distribution, spanning a huge area of the eastern US. So red maples are occurring in those areas where it's getting very hot. They're also occurring in those areas where the temperature is not rising as quickly. And so understanding from the intraspecific or within the species perspective of how those trees are responding is something that's very interesting to me personally, as I'm interested in the geography kind of biological diversity. Another aspect of this that makes it quite difficult is that individual species don't always respond in the same ways. Poison ivy has made the popular press as well as the scientific press a number of times in terms of its predicted responses and documented responses to climate change. And as this title implies, it's going to be one of the big winners of a warming world. So it grows better. There are also reports that the chemicals that are in it that can cause allergic reactions in a lot of us are getting more potent within the plants that are there. To contrast that, pollinators have really been threatened by climate change as well as other activities. And so the prediction is that a lot of pollinators are going to be lost. It's something like 90% of bumblebee species in North America have been reduced or gone extinct in the last century or so. And so some species are going to be winners and some species are going to be losers. And it takes a lot of data to be able to really make good predictions about which species are going to fall into those two categories. Typically, it is the very specialized species that we're seeing greater losses in, and that's because specialization is really good when things don't change. When they do, though, those are often the first species to become lost or go extinct. And then finally, lasting responses take quite a bit of time to develop. This is not something that you're likely to see as a lasting response over a single year. So here I'm showing you some phenological data that is from 2011 to 2019. And it's based on the onset day of the year. So essentially the first days when folks were seeing pollen release from red maples. So each dot represents an observation of a tree that was releasing pollen, of a red maple tree that was releasing pollen. So you can see we kind of have a pattern down here. And if you follow this line, it is kind of slowly decreasing. And in terms of onset day of the year, that means as we have gotten closer to the present, maples are releasing pollen earlier and earlier. But this is not a strong trend necessarily. It's certainly a declining trend. If I were to take just 2 years out of here, and expand this graph, it would be very, very difficult to see that trend in just that short amount of time. Most organisms at the species level do take quite a bit of time to respond to these changes. And that also makes it difficult to sort of study them unless you have that long-term data. How do we get those data? Well, we have been employing citizen scientists to help collect those data over time, as well as over a lot of species and a lot of geographic areas. So citizen scientists are those folks who contribute to professional science by collaborating with those scientists directly, or perhaps collecting data that they don't necessarily know where it goes. We then can pull those data that are publicly available and use them in a variety of ways to answer different kinds of questions. Citizen science has been known under a number of different additional terms, such as crowd science or crowdsourced science or networked science, if you perhaps have heard one of those terms as opposed to citizen science. But they all refer to the same general thing: scientific research that's conducted in whole or in part by the general public, often in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. What qualifies you as a citizen scientist? Just someone who's collecting data in a systematic manner and providing it to others for use. You know, I consider myself a professional scientist in the area of plant biology, but I'm also a citizen scientist because I collect and contribute data to other kinds of projects in science that are not focused on plant biology. We, of course, as humans, have been doing this, making these systematic natural observations for a very, very long time, essentially since we've been walking on Earth. The first time that this term citizen science really became kind of part of the popular language was in 2014, when it was entered into the Oxford English Dictionary. Perhaps you've heard of the extensive records that the Japanese have kept on cherry blossom flowering. And this graph shows you, over a very long time, how much data they've collected. So we're going back as far as 800 AD. That's a tremendous amount of data that have been kept. Why do they do this? Well, cherry blossoms, of course, are a very important component of Japanese culture in a number of different ways, and they really celebrate those. And so folks have been keen to collect data on the first time that they're appearing. This probably started, in an effort to kind of spread the word among Japanese people to get outside and see the cherry blossoms. It wasn't necessarily done to answer some sort of science question. But now, as we look back at this, we can see, certainly trends and ups and downs in terms of the first appearance of cherry blossoms. Note as we come closer to the present, this graph only goes to 2016, but they continue to keep records of the cherry blossoms in Japan, that these flowering dates are getting earlier and earlier. I think the last few years it has been about mid-March when the first cherry blossoms are starting to appear. Within the US, a number of folks have been considered as kind of early citizen scientists. Some of these folks were true scientists, professional scientists in that sense, and others were simply folks who were really in tune with nature and very interested in understanding nature from their own personal perspective. Lucky for us, they kept very detailed records of their observations. Thomas Jefferson, for example, kept very detailed records of crops that were grown, when they came up, how they did on his properties in Virginia. The philosopher and naturalist Henry David Thoreau, of course, living in Massachusetts, Walden Pond, kept extensive records that looked somewhat like this. I know this looks like chicken scratch. I've tried to read this, even blown up. It looks like chicken scratch for his own handwriting. But in this column, he wrote down individual species. And then each of these other columns was a year in the time that he was recording these species. And these details in here indicate, when he was seeing the first leaves or the flowers. He has a lot of information in his records about the climate as well. And these have actually been used in scientific research in comparison to those same areas today to see when species are leafing out or they're producing flowers. Aldo Leopold, down here on the bottom, of course, was a professional scientist. He was an ecologist, is considered the father of wildlife biology. He worked primarily in Wisconsin and documented extensively how organisms were responding to environmental cues when it was warming up, when it was, more precipitation or less precipitation. He passed that love of nature and that desire to document all of this to his daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley, and she really carried it on extensively throughout her life. She lived to be 93 years old, and throughout her entire life, she was documenting um, biodiversity that was in nature in relation to what she was seeing in terms of the climate that was out there. Now, Leopold made this quote: "Keeping records enhances the pleasure of the search and the chance of finding order and meaning in these events." And I think this says a lot about what can be said when you're writing it down. I think a lot of times I see something in nature and I think I'm going to remember that because it's so memorable. A year goes by and it has, mostly escaped my mind. I might remember a few details, but if I've written it down and I have started to do that, I can go back to my notebook and be sure it was January 15th when I did see that happening, as opposed to relying on our memories. It also makes it available, after we're gone. All of this documentation from Jefferson and Leopold and Thoreau, we wouldn't be able to use any of that if they hadn't written it down, if they hadn't recorded it and kept it in secure locations. The use of citizen scientists in terms of professional scientific studies and professional research, has just exploded in the 2000s. And this is by and large the result of the internet, of being able to use the internet to share data, to contribute data. It makes it so much easier. Before I started the talk, I was lamenting having to record data on paper sheets on a clipboard and then having to take them back and enter them into an online form. And now it's easy enough. I can just use my phone, have with me. I can be standing right in front of the plant, push a button, and that data goes immediately to the server that maintains all of that data. So what I'm showing you just on this slide is a study that was published to look at how much citizen science data have contributed to scientific research. So you're seeing the number of publications on this axis, and then by years from 1997 to 2014. You can sort of ignore the colors of these bars. If you just look at the total size of each bar, you can see it's kind of small in the 90s, and then we start to see really an increase with things taking off in 2010. And this would continue to increase if this went out to 2024. You would see more and more and more scientific publications coming from the data that are produced by citizen scientists. So it has been estimated that today there are more than 1 million volunteers, 1 million citizen scientists working around the world and contributing more than $2.5 billion annually to biodiversity research. If we were to try and employ students, graduate students, ourselves to collect all of these data, it would be virtually impossible. There just aren't enough bodies to go around with the number of people who are contributing these kinds of data. There are citizen science projects for all interests. So just showing you a little snippet up here of some of the options. Citizenscience.gov deals with primarily government associated agencies, government agencies, and projects that they're looking to do. So these might range from, tidal wetlands or climate data for NOAA to looking at images from outer space and trying to identify different features for a project. Perhaps many of you are aware of and participate in the Audubon Christmas bird count or the North American breeding bird survey. Those are certainly, well established and well publicized and well used citizen science projects involving a lot of data that come in on an annual basis. Catch the king tide, of course, is something popular around here in the fall of measuring the tidal rate. We have other projects as well that are measuring tidal flow as well as the high tides at certain times of the year. GenoCam is one that's looking at images of Jupiter and helping to decide what points of interest GenoCam will photograph. Zooniverse is a kind of a collective. So it's a place where if you have a project that you need citizen science help with, you can put it on that website and kind of entice people to come and collect data for you. So this includes projects that are biological as well as more in the physical sciences. iNaturalist is also a big one. It has exploded in the last few years, of course, asking people to capture images, upload those, and provide, identifications. That is another one that we often use for identifying the locations of species. And those records sometimes have identified new records for a state, new species records for a state, and even sometimes potentially new species. I'm working with some folks who are in California who potentially have identified a new orchid. I'm using genetics to understand whether this might be a new orchid, but they were the folks who first found this thing and photographed it and found me through iNaturalist. So it's pretty interesting how these apps and these projects can connect people around the world too. What I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about and what you came to hear is the Phenology project that is happening through Nature's Notebook. So this is a project that is sort of the front face of the National Phenology Network. And the U.S. National Phenology Network began in 2007 to collect data for phenological research and applications. Phenology is technically defined as the study of cyclic and seasonal phenomena, especially in relation to climate change. So, for example, in this with this image photo figure, that's the word I was looking for, of the monarch butterfly life cycle, what we're interested in capturing as data is at what time of year is the monarch in each one of these stages as we move from eggs to caterpillars to chrysalis to emerging adults again. These efforts have come out of early scientific efforts to document changes in when plants were flowering or when animals were moving about. And one of the first ones in the US was the Lilac Project. So this was started in Montana, I believe, with folks who were in Wisconsin as well. And they were documenting lilacs. I think certain species of honeysuckles were also brought into the project. This was started in the 1950s. And so they kept, records. They engaged people in collecting data well before any of us had computers that we were using. And so people would collect data and then send it to the researchers who were managing this project. So these and others, Project Budburst was another sort of early one out of Chicago Botanical Garden. All of these things kind of grew and grew to the point where some researchers said we need a national effort. And that's really where the National Phenology Network grew out of. Within Nature's Notebook, so again, that's kind of the public face of the National Phenology Network. That's where you can go to find species to observe. You can get the data that they have in their database. It's all publicly available, relatively easy to get. Within this, there are nearly 1,800 species of plants and animals that are available for people to provide data on. Within the National Phenology Network, citizen scientists, are very active. There are nearly 23,000 of those observers around the country working at nearly 18,000 sites. And this is data from 2021 only, so we're missing a few years here. It's grown quite extensively in the last couple of years. But even at that time, more than 3 million observations had been made. So that's a pretty impressive data set that's been collected by folks like yourself who are, just observing on your daily routine and contributing that data to these data sets. There are, a number of different things that we have learned from having these data sets. They're often used to make predictions about the spring allergy season. For example, up here, Phenology helps to predict the expansion of extremely allergenic ragweed. So they're often used. I often see them, referenced in terms of the allergy maps that come out in the spring, because that's something that I'm very interested in personally, because I have pretty bad hay fever. These data have also been used to understand, aspects that are not natural systems, wild systems, as well as urban environments. And sometimes they're used to kind of test the validity of other methods, such as validating remotely sensed data of, for example, when plants have leaves on them. So a huge number of different uses of these different data sets. Down here, I provide a website that can give you, full listing from the National Phenology Network of all kinds of scientific analyses that have used the data that are available in that database. As far as who is learning from these data, it spans the general public as well as scientists, as well as professionals in other areas. Graduate students have created projects. They have also used existing data that are available in the database. Reporters, for example, especially on the Weather Channel, or weather reporters talking about what things are looking like and how quickly the season is going to proceed. The fall leaf reports are based on these data that are collected in terms of making those predictions about when to see the best fall colors. As this example shows, this is the vice president of the Davy Tree group using phenology data to forecast kind of pest abundance and how to manage those. And of course, phenology has been brought to K through 12 education, engaging students in active learning to monitor plants, to study plants and understand them. So a huge number of different uses of the data and also contributors to additional data are coming from this project. At the Botanical Garden, we have an active phenology monitoring project. There were 7 species that have been monitored at the garden, and these were monitored from starting in 2010. This was started by Tatiana Lobova, who was a fellow faculty member at ODU, and I took it over in 2018 after I started at ODU. From Tatiana's data, we have been able to see that of these 7 species, 4, which are shown here, buttonbush, dogwood, highbush blueberry, and mayapple, have shown a sensitivity to local changes in temperature in their phenology. Buttonbush exhibited the most dramatic change by flowering and fruiting later during this time. Oftentimes we think it's getting warmer, it's warmer early in the year, so things should start happening faster. And that is, in fact, what you often see and what we saw in dogwood, blueberry, and mayapple, but buttonbush had the opposite response. The bottom here is just to show you that temperatures, at least at the Norfolk Airport, have been increasing over time. And the records that we collected from these species show that that is consistent with this increase in temperature. We don't exactly know how that increase in temperature is influencing the physiology of these plants, but the pattern has been established that they are responding in relation to changes in the climate. There are actually relatively few data collection sites that contribute to the National Phenology Network from Virginia. So this shows you a map. Each triangle is a different site. The colors are just showing you when those data have been collected, so across the calendar year. You'll notice the green one down here is the Norfolk Botanical Garden, but beyond that, we don't have very many other sites in Eastern Virginia. We've got one over here on the Eastern Shore, one here, quite a few up in Northern Virginia, and a number that are kind of along the Blue Ridge along Highway 81 over here. So we're very, very interested in having more folks contribute data from Southeastern Virginia. In terms of the desired species to monitor, some of those would be, the 4 species identified at the Botanical Garden as having a sensitivity to changes in climate. Again, that's common buttonbush, flowering dogwood, highbush blueberry, and mayapple. I'm very interested in having individuals from outside of the Botanical Garden to see if we could see the same kinds of trends to sensitivity. And then another one I'm going to tell you about is a project that a graduate student in my lab is working on. And this is partially in connection with a campaign that the National Phenology Network is doing called Nectar Connectors. And the emphasis in this project is to learn about the flowering timing of nectar sources for monarchs and other pollinators. I've taken on some species at the Botanical Garden to contribute to this project over in the pollinator garden. I would imagine that a lot of you probably grow quite a few plants that are desirable to pollinators, particularly in the spring and summertime. And so you probably already have these species in your framework, in your viewpoint. The project that we're focusing on involves monarch butterflies. And of course, the eastern US represents an area through which monarch butterflies move on their migrations northward and southward. Virginia included, but a study that was published in 2008 showed that there are differences in the quality of monarchs, whether they are occurring in the Piedmont or along the coast. So what I'm showing you in these 2 graphs is wing length of monarchs and the wet mass. Both of these are an indication of the health of the monarchs. And these graphs suggest that populations of monarchs in coastal areas are not as healthy as those in the Piedmont. So the coastal here in the little squares, shorter wing lengths and lower wet mass. The authors of this study suggested that habitat quality might be behind these differences. And so a graduate student who's working in my lab, Megan Britton, shown here, she is a former middle school teacher who has gone back to graduate school, and she's working on her PhD, eventually hoping to teach at the college level. She's very interested in urban ecology. And so her project has focused on surveying green spaces around Hampton Roads to see where we might be able to plant more milkweeds or encourage more activity for monarchs, or perhaps better habitats for monarchs. Of course, there is the Monarch Way Station program that a lot of folks have signed up for, but this is a pretty involved thing. And we're looking for areas that maybe don't take quite as much activity, don't require quite as much activity by the folks who are doing it, in order to provide these plants and these spaces for monarchs to survive in. So she's really looking at things like parks and preserves, that are in Norfolk, Virginia Beach. She lives in Newport News, so she's working a lot on the peninsula as well. We, of course, need data. We need extra data, particularly from residential areas, because that's a harder thing to get to because we can't just walk into someone's backyard like we can go to a public park or something. And so trying to figure out, ways of getting folks to provide us data just on survey data on the presence of milkweeds and monarch activity as well is really what we're looking for. So our target species for Megan's research include all native species of milkweed, as well as cultivated forms. We're interested in kind of data from the annual cycle of leaves as well as flowers, because the adults, of course, are using the flowers as food sources, and the caterpillars are munching on those leaves. We're also hoping to get data on monarchs. There are already existing monarch monitoring programs, and so we do draw some of the data from there, but having more data is always a great thing. And then also other nectar plants. And the Nectar Connectors campaign through the National Phenology Network is a way that we can really get some of that data, but really encouraging people to collect those data on a variety of different kinds of plants, because these are also important in attracting adult monarchs to the area and providing them with food that they may need. In the last part of this, I'm going to turn to actually using kind of the app that is known as Nature's Notebook. So this is available online, and you can certainly write stuff down in notebook or on paper and then upload it to the online site. There are a few more things, easier things to do in the online version than you can the mobile app. But if you're outside, the mobile app is a great resource. It is pretty easy to use. I will say that it occasionally is a little buggy for me. It doesn't do everything I would like it to do, but it's not horribly bad. My email address is down there again. I'm going to mention it at the end. If you get into this and you run into problems or anything, always feel free to email me. I'm happy to try and walk you through it. But what I wanted to do was just kind of run you through the app these are pictures from my cell phone as I use the app in terms of how you would set things up once you have signed up for an account. So when you first come in, you're going to see something like this with your sites listed. If you haven't set up any sites yet, you wouldn't see this list, but these are all sites that I have set up. Your site should be a different location. So I have, for example, a ODU campus one. I have the native plant garden at the Norfolk Botanical Garden. Mirror Lake is a different site, and the Enchanted Forest is another site. If you want to create a new site, you just click this little button down here, and it will pop up with this screen. And you can give it a name, be as descriptive as you want with that, hit the continue button. And it does record GPS automatically, or it may pop up and ask you for your location availability or to allow that to occur. Okay. Be careful in creating sites because these can be hard to get rid of. I don't know of a way of getting rid of them on the mobile app, but you can get rid of them in the online site. So if you do make a mistake, go to the online site, log in, and you can delete a site. But that's one of the areas where it's a little clunky. So once you have a site set up, the next thing you need to do is choose the species that you want to look at. So if you go to the next little tab up here, plants and animals, at the bottom, you can click on this button that says add plants and animals, and that will give you a new window where you can search for a particular species. You can search by the common name or the scientific name, and it's one of those things where if you start typing, it'll auto-populate things that match those first few letters. Pick the one you want. give it a nickname. So you can use a common name. You can call it, tree one, whatever you want to call it in here. I would give each plant that you monitor a different nickname. If you're monitoring 5 loblolly pines, then I would suggest calling it loblolly pine 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then once you hit the save button down here, it will pop up as one of the species that you're going to monitor. Then you have to actually collect the data. So the data that we're looking for are these phenophases. So the phenophases are things like, does it have the start of leaves? Does it have flowers or flower buds? When is it in full leaf? When does it have fruits? When are the leaves starting to change color? And when are those leaves falling off? Or if it's an herbaceous species, perennial, but it's dying back, when do you last see any living leaves? And that's often called leaf senescence. So I give you another website down here that has very, very detailed information on phenophases more generally. There are also sites for a lot of the individual species that'll tell you exactly what you are looking for. So recording the data, once you click on your species, you'll get to, and click on the observation button up here, you'll get to a screen that looks like this. And this is going to list all those phenophases that the NPN is interested in getting data on. So these all have to do with leaves, breaking leaves, leaf buds, presence of leaves. Are they getting bigger? Are they colored? And are they falling? So you just kind of click through yes or no. The question mark is there if you really aren't sure if those are present or not. Don't be afraid to use that. Don't use it for everything, but don't be afraid to use it if you just really aren't sure. Unsure data is better for us than clicking yes or no. That is actually an incorrect statement. You can also click on this little information button, and that will give you, exactly what they're looking for as breaking leaf bud. What does that mean? For some species, it'll give you very specific information related to just that species. For others, it's a more general thing, like this one is. What does a breaking leaf bud actually look like? If you click a yes on there, it's going to pop up a new window that looks like this one on the bottom. And that is, how many of that thing are you seeing? And so here again, it gives you choices. If it's a lot of them, more than 10,000, click on that. If you're not sure about how many to count, always clicking not sure is a possibility. This is kind of like gravy on top. If you give us yes, no's for the day it's happening, this is just extra information. It's very, very helpful, but we can do actually quite a bit with yeses and nos. So you just click through those. Next, kind of below that screen will be reproductive characteristics, whether it's flowers or fruits or cones in the case of gymnosperms. And again, you're just looking for, yes and no's in terms of is it present? For me, these are a little bit harder sometimes. So here I'm showing you an example of flowering dogwood as it develops from the earliest inflorescence bud to a fully open flower, open flowers within this inflorescence. And so, when you get to something like open flowers and you see maybe that, technically that's not an open flower. The bracts are open, but these individual flowers are still closed. This is the open flower stage. But I would say that we're probably close enough to that's going to be open within a couple of days. And so if you happen to collect open flowers, yes, for that stage, it's not a horrible thing. But it does take a little bit of practice and sort of looking at individuals very closely to get accurate data for several of these things for certain species, especially trees that are really high up. When they're asking me for cones and are they releasing pollen or not, very early on before we see, huge amounts of pollen falling on cars and such, it can be hard to tell whether they're releasing pollen. Always, always, always make sure to hit the Save Data button. It does not always save automatically. And if you do all that work and you don't hit that, it won't go into the database. Okay. Once again, if you're not sure, it's okay to hit that question mark button for some, or if you have to hit it for all, that's okay. Any data is valuable data, in my opinion. And remember always to save the data. It will also ask you to record site visit details. So that is this window under the observation tab. And so they're just looking for, how much time did you spend observing? I believe that this is more important for animals because animals are moving about. And, if you're out there for 2 minutes, you might not see that butterfly fly by. A plant, it's not moving. So 2 minutes out there is pretty much the same as 2 hours out there in terms of did you capture it or not. But if you are observing animals, this can be very, very important information. And once again, remember to save data. So, this screen, I'm going to click through all these things, will show you whether the data have gone through. Okay, so if your data have gone through on the date, you'll see a green check mark. If they haven't gone through, then you might see some sort of error message up here. One reason you might get that error message is a setting, syncing over Wi-Fi only. Kind of the default for this is yes. And so if you are outside and you're using your cell phone and you're not close to any Wi-Fi, it will not automatically move to the server. And so you might get this kind of message. As soon as you go back on Wi-Fi, it should sync, but you can change that if you want to use your cellular data. You can change that and it should sync within a minute or so of you hitting the button down here to sync. Okay. Sometimes when I have changed these settings, I have to restart the app and log in again in order for those to take effect, which is not anything new for apps generally. And that is, pretty much it for using the app. It takes a little bit of time to work through those menus and kind of see, what the different buttons are and what they do, to go through them. But it's not a terribly difficult thing, I don't think, to master, with the occasional blip where it doesn't sync, it won't sync, it doesn't sync for a whole day, and I have to just close it up and come back to it later. So not necessarily a bad idea to have a backup notebook with you. So I know I'm running out of time here. So just kind of wrapping up some things, regular data collection of just a few species can really help us understand the impacts of climate change on species in Hampton Roads. In the National Phenology Network, those folks who are citizen science observers, the average number of species that they are contributing data on is around 3. So that's not a huge number of species to have to learn kind of the characteristics of them. I will say that the best data, all data are good, but the very best data are from multiple plants at a site and during every week of the growing season. I know that is a big commitment. I haven't even been able to sometimes make it every single week of the growing season to get my observations recorded. But if you can at least get them on a regular basis, we're better able to capture that exact time when the leaves came out or the leaves were fully out. And so having regular data collected across that whole growing season is the optimal data collection strategy. Why multiple plants? Well, there's a lot of variation in nature. You think about just humans, so much variation in the characteristics of humans. Plants and other animals are no exception to that. And you might pick the aberrant plant to observe. So choosing multiple plants just allows us to kind of take an average for a particular species in terms of how that species is responding. And we have captured multiple plants at the botanical garden in our phenological monitoring. So I would say at least two. You probably don't need any more than four at a particular site. Collecting data can, pretty easily be incorporated into a weekly gardening or recreational routine. It doesn't take me very long to push the buttons for a particular species and move on. The longest thing for collecting data, what takes me the longest amount of time, was just walking around the botanical garden to go from Mirror Lake all the way to Enchanted Forest. So that took the greatest amount of time. And to just reiterate that we're very interested at OU and in my lab in having more local data on milkweeds, monarchs, and other nectar plants, as well as, those species at the botanical garden. We're not actively doing a research project on those 4 species that we monitor at the botanical garden, but still I'm very interested to see if those trends are going to continue, given that we continue to see increases in temperature. And my email address is down there again. I'm always happy to answer questions about using the app or about other research in this particular area or other species that you might have an interest in observing. There are a lot of species available. And if you go to the National Phenology Network website, you can actually plug in Virginia to see what species, they consider as growing in Virginia and available for monitoring. So you can come up with a list in that way. And with that, I will stop and be happy to take any questions that you all have.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions in the chat. The first one is, so Facebook probably has a lot of useful citizen data. Are you guys trying to pull those out? And presumably any other social media sites?
We have not tried Facebook or any other social media, and that is largely because there's so much already available through Nature's Notebook and iNaturalist that we have largely focused on those projects. But that's a great suggestion, and I will pass that on to Megan to look to see if there's stuff that she can pull out from there. She's pretty early in her graduate time, so her project is still sort of coming together, so to speak, as we continue to develop and sort of see what areas we want to focus on more across Hampton Roads. Thank you.
When you are using the app, are you able to see data that's already been entered by other people?
You cannot get those data through the app. You would have to go to the National Phenology Network website, and they have it's like the visualization tool. And on that, they have a number of different projects where they've analyzed data, but then you can also do a custom analysis. And so you can pull years, or you can pull different climate aspects and different species, and you can really decide what you want to look at. That is intended for folks who don't want to pull out all the data themselves and do like statistical analysis on. That's certainly also possible, and that's kind of what we do. But that visualization tool is intended for anyone and everyone to be able to use the data in a customized way.
And how long is the data stored once you enter it into the notebook?
It will stay there indefinitely. In terms of on your phone, I guess that would be limited by the storage capacity of your phone. But as long as if you have a cell connection or you have a Wi-Fi connection, it is immediately going to be pushed to that national server. So, if you see the green check mark on there, you lost your phone, or your phone went dead or something, it's in the national network. So you shouldn't have lost that data just because it's on your phone, assuming you have that green check mark. on there. And I've had things where it wouldn't sync. I didn't have a great cell phone signal, and it took, several hours later before it actually synced, but it was still there. It all went through. Sometimes that can be a little scary feeling, like I just spent all this time and all this work on that, and I don't think it's there, but it's actually stored within there.
Are there any specific plants that need more observations than others? And I guess perhaps within that list that you provided, are some more popular than others already, I guess?
You would think that milkweeds would be a really popular plant because of their charisma as far as a plant to grow and their association with monarchs, but there actually are not a lot of milkweed data. I was trying to pull some of that from the database to show in the slide, but there are not a lot of data. Trees are pretty well represented. Things that the National Phenology Network has developed as campaigns. So those are target species. They have a number of different themes to those invasive species. They were looking at native dogwood versus some of the cultivars of native dogwood to see if those were differing. So things where there's been an awareness and they're drawing attention to those particular species are pretty well represented. Most trees, I would say, are pretty well represented. It's the herbaceous species that tend to have less data for them. They used to have a policy of not including orchids because they didn't want to provide location information for orchids for poachers to potentially go out and take them. They have since relaxed that. And so the last time I checked, I'm pretty sure that they had a few orchid species that they were monitoring. So
Um, I'm going to take a real quick break and launch our poll. It should just pop up on everybody's screen, and it's just 4 quick questions. And then you can just close out when you're done. We have 2 more questions. So can you add additional plants to the Nature's Notebook, or do you just have to work with the species that are already listed?
I believe you could add them, but it would take contacting the the overseers of Nature's Notebook to get those added. So you can't personally put them in, but there's no reason why they couldn't be added if you had, a compelling reason for wanting them to be in there. And that was really the impetus of why some of the native orchid species, are now available for monitoring. Is someone really wanted to have those species in there. I haven't tried lobbying for the addition of other species, but I do know that they will do that.
Okay. And then there's a thank you for introducing this exciting app to our group. And then the last question is about your email address, and just double checking the last E on your last name is not on there. And they just want to make sure that that's correct and not a typo.
That is correct. Yes. Thank ODU for chopping off that last E. So it makes it kind of an odd email address. But yes, it is LE Wallach at odu.edu.
Okay. All right, those are all the questions that we have in the chat right now. If somebody in the audience wants to come off mute and ask a final one really quick, you may do so. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. Our next talk is going to be in March, so look for announcements through our social media and website for that. And thank you again to Lisa for joining us tonight with this really compelling invitation to become citizen scientists.
Thank you all for being here. It's been my pleasure, and I hope to see data from you in the Nature's Notebook database. So, but feel free to contact me if you have questions about using it or other questions about the research that we're doing.